Mr. Felgenhauer, there is already a fatigue, I think, going on in the world about whether there's any solution to the Syrian issue. Is this a new inspiration, or this is going to be, Mr. Felgenhauer, one of those things?
Well, this initiative is a strong attempt by Moscow to push forward some kind of process that could end the Syrian civil war. It's understood in Moscow that there is no, indeed, pure military solution to the Syrian problem. That means that Russia right now uses different means to coerce and split the Syrian opposition, to find and fractions of the Syrian opposition that will be ready to cooperate and help them build a base, these power base. These agreements, these safe zones, are sort of fiefdoms that will be granted to the loyal Syrian opposition, in understanding that they will go and oppose militarily the bad Syrian opposition, the designated terrorists.
Ambassador Kattouf, it seems that Mr. Felgenhauer from Russia, in his tone, is not that enthusiastic about the plan himself.
Well, listen, we've already had previous talks in Astana and other attempts to get a ceasefire. And what we have seen generally is either Russia is unable or unwilling to prevent President Assad and his coalition of forces from breaking these ceasefires. I'm particularly referring, for instance, to attacks that Bashar al-Assad's forces launched after the last talks in Astana near Damascus on the water sources for Damascus. There was no indication that the forces he attacked belonged to proscribed groups like the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, or to what used to be called the Nusra Front. And also Russia failed to stop chemical weapons from being used as far as the U.S. is concerned.
It's very interesting.
So there's a credibility problem.
It's very interesting that there's not only a credibility thing, but also a lot of finger pointing going on just in the answers by the two of you gentlemen. May I remind you of the latest development? The White House said President Trump of the United States and the Russian President Vladimir Putin chatted on Tuesday, as you mentioned, discussing the biggest challenges in 2017, including the Syrian civil war. The Kremlin said the possibility of a first meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin was floated during even that phone conversation. So is Syria this time trying to resolve it in any way, a foot in the door for Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin to start certain kinds of discussions to resolve that problem? Ambassador Kattouf.
Look, all right-thinking people want an end to this horrible conflict. But everybody has different ideas about what the end state should look like. As your viewers know, the U.S. has long said that at some point Bashar al-Assad has to go. Russia and Iran seem to take a different view, although Russia's been a bit ambiguous about the end state where Bashar is concerned. And yes, it would be a great thing if Putin and Trump can get together and agree to some principles, particularly those that protect civilian populations in Syria.
All right.
But the devil is always in the details.
Okay. How important are those details, Mr. Felgenhauer? Will the meeting, the telephone call, the enough fatigue from around the world about so-called end game in Syria be enough for seeking some solutions?
Well, as it was just said, the problem is in implementation. Russia has quite some cloth in Syria with the Syrian government and with the pro-Iranian forces, but it does not directly control them. And previous attempts to impose a ceasefire didn't end very well. There was lots of violations happening all the time, and everyone blaming everyone. Now, apparently, the idea is to institutionalize these rebel-controlled areas and grant them to good rebels. It's something like the Russian forces did in Chechnya when they ended the Chechen war, and or what the Americans did in Iraq with the arousing, with moving kind of to have Sunni tribesmen, Sunni fighters to fight the bad guys, the terrorists. Will that work or not? There's always problems with such kind of moves.
Okay.
No one really knows for now for
here
sure.
in Beijing, what is this about? I mean, what is going on in Syria? Is it really about the settlement plan? Or is it about the big powers, for example, Russia, the United States, and some of the regional ones trying to struggle to have a bigger proportion of control of the situation over there and use it as a proxy ground?
Well, there are everything in this Syria war. Yeah, everything you can find.
Yes, I know it's everything, but what exactly is the main conflict over here?
Right. I think now different time there are different keywords. So before we heard about like proxy war, and then we heard about like Assad must go or not go, and also not long ago this chemical weapon issue. But now this time again for this Astana talk, now we're focused on this. Another keyword is coming out, that is safer zone. So from those keywords, you can see those different players, they are playing different game. So before that game is just targeting on Assad, go or not go. And then now it seems not a matter, that issue. Now people talking about how to bring the US and Russia together, trying to mend their relations.
Do you see that as a healthy development, or do you see that as a setback in the overall nature of the discussion?
I think it's a healthy development,
there we go.
Because at least now the US sent a very high level, that's a negotiator right now to the Astana. Before, they have never sent such a high level official to be there. So which means now President Trump has making very serious consideration about how to engage with Russia, to make this Syria crisis back on the political, diplomatic track.
Ambassador Kattouf, it is no secret that there has been some differences between President Trump and the establishment of the Republican Party, or shall I say, inside the Beltway, about how to deal with Russia and what to do with Russia on Syria issue. Do you think that difference is getting ever smaller as we are talking right now, or getting ever more bigger at this point? What does that mean eventually for a negotiation involving all parties, particularly in which Russia also participates?
Well, the Trump people had made some very conciliatory statements about Syria and Russia's involvement just before this chemical attack occurred. And they were forced to go about 180 degrees in the other direction. So we don't really know all the time where Trump is, frankly, right in this country. He says different things on different days. Very early, it appeared that he did not care much if Bashar al-Assad stayed in power. His focus was on eliminating Daesh and other radical such groups from the region, not just Syria, but Iraq and elsewhere. More recently, with the chemical attack, he at least felt the need to distance himself from Bashar al-Assad and what had happened, and to let his officials criticize Russia for not disarming Syria of all its chemical weapons. My own belief is that Trump likes to deal. He likes to make deals. He wants to make deals. He would love, I think, to make a deal with Putin, but there are domestic political difficulties, as you well know, concerning what happened during the election campaign and what the investigation is going to show, which is the investigation, of course, is ongoing.
The investigation has always drip, drip, drip all the time in order to challenge President Trump. Ambassador Kattouf, I still want to ask you, what about this safe zone plan? Since we have a plan raised by Russia, so is that going to be one of those areas the deal can happen, Ambassador Kattouf?
Theoretically, yes. I mean, Trump has talked also about safe zones for civilians. And it's something that he has said more than once. So apparently he believes in it. But establishing safe zones are not so easy. You have to have no-fly zones. Those have to be enforced. You have to have troops on the ground ensuring that the wrong people don't go into the camps and terrorize people or force young people to join their militias and the like. And it's not clear that Iran and Bashar al-Assad would really allow this to happen.
All right. Well,
and they have the ability to sabotage it.
Yeah. Earlier, Mr. Felgenhauer, you did talk about the devils in the details. Can devils also work together this time?
Well, we should understand that if the United States and Washington have their own internal issues. Russia and Moscow has its own. Right now, Russia is in the final stages of putting together a very major rearmament program. And so the Russian military right now are fighting the Russian finance ministry and the finance part of the government on how much trillions of rubles should be spent on new arms. So that means the Russian military do not really want that close cooperation with America. They need America as a threat. Though in Syria, of course, it's obvious the Kremlin wants to cooperate to some at least extent with the United States. Will the overall strategic interest of the Russian military prevail? Will the Russian military actually sabotage to some extent what's happening on the ground in Syria? That cannot be excluded. So it's a very, very complicated situation where many wills are involved, many powers are involved, which are very entangled between each other. So it's not just details of what's on the piece of paper signed in Astana. And actually the rebels didn't sign. But though they were present then when it was signed by Turkey, Russia, and Iran. But there's also the multi-power play, very complicated.
I understand there is a very complicated issue involved here. That's why it takes such a long time. We are continuing talking about it. Ms. He, though, China has been quite a neutral player in this regard. The ambassador to the Syrian issue, Xie Xiaoyan, is going to travel in some of the relevant countries in order to make sure he compares notes and try to bring people together on some kinds of common ground. What exactly are the common grounds are we looking at?
I think at least the two common grounds has been already laid down. One is the political solution. No military way can solve this issue, Syria crisis. So the past 7 years war has been proved that. So now back to the political talk, back to the diplomatic track. So that's one thing, common issue. Another common issue, I think that also has been put forward by Chinese side. That is, those process of the diplomatic means should be started from easier to the harder issue. From easy thing that is the ceasefire. Now, if you talk about political, like a interim government, that's not possible. That's not a feasibility issue. So starts from ceasefire. So that's why now ceasefire talk has been undertaken in Astana. Talk for at least now is the 4th round. That's a complementary with those Geneva talk dominated by the United Nations. So I think China supported this kind of way from easier to the harder. So from ceasefire first, but we have to look about whenever there's a new idea coming out, then a lot of difficulties also coming out.
Right.
For example, that safer zone sounds like a good idea, can split those rebel forces and also guarantee some humanitarian corridor, but also lots of problems. Who will administrate this safer zone? Is it a no-fly zone will be established before? So who is to be sent to even the ground troop to guarantee that corridor? So a lot of things coming out.
A long list that you have just mentioned, Ms. He. So, Ambassador Kattouf, Mr. Felgenhauer, from the U.S. side, from the Russian side, from the regional power side, can anyone help to solve what Ms. He just mentioned, at least some number of those issues on that long list? Ambassador Kattouf.
There seems to me that there is one issue that Russia, Iran, the United States, Bashar al-Assad, and to a lesser extent Turkey, and I should mention China also would agree upon, and that is the dangers of radical Islamist movements in that region of the world.
That's right.
So there is a consensus, I believe, even with Turkey to a large extent, that Daesh has to be eliminated to the greatest extent possible, at least militarily. You can't really eliminate an idea, but you can eliminate a lot of their military capabilities. Also, we don't talk much about what used to be called the Nusra Front, but now it's called Tahrir, or the liberation of Syria, Tahrir al-Sham, particularly strong in Idlib province.
Yeah, so Ambassador Kattouf, what exactly is your point? You're saying these can be the common grounds that the countries can work together, but you're putting it in a very
Yes.
different direction because we're talking about a safe zone. Before the safe zone, there's ceasefire. On the ceasefire, can anybody do anything? And now you're dragging us to another direction, which is helpful, I guess. But eventually, can anybody do
Well,
anything?
I guess I'm saying
Any
how
of the
difficult.
talking points. Yeah.
I guess what I'm really saying is how difficult it is to enforce a ceasefire, because Bashar al-Assad and his Iranian allies will look at Idlib province, for instance, and say, you have all these groups, even some of the groups that went to the talks cooperating with the radical Islamists in Tahrir Asham, because they're among the strongest fighting groups on the ground among the opposition.
Okay.
And many opposition groups are afraid that Bashar al-Assad will defeat them one by one if they don't stand and fight alongside Tahrir Asham.
All right.
So what I guess I am saying is it's incredibly problematic.
Okay, Mr.
Even though in principle, all the major powers are against Tahrir Asham.
Mr. Felgenhauer, Ambassador Kattouf is saying, well, probably the ball is in your court or in Iran's court. Mr. Felgenhauer.
Well, I mean, of course, everyone says that they're against Islamic terrorists and no one likes ISIS or Al-Qaeda connected groups. And but when it comes down to real cooperation, there's enormous problems.
Right.
And there's a lot of suspicion. The Russian military and the American military do not really want to cooperate much at all. They have to be pressurized very seriously by political leadership from both sides to actually begin working together in good faith. So that means there should be leadership coming from politicians from White House, from the Kremlin, if something, a kind of real cooperation could be achieved. Talking about cooperation is not enough. There are very serious systemic difficulties to do anything together.